The silence of the Silver Lake, a secret buried for 20 years. They say the dead don't talk, but in a town like Silver Lake, the ground has a way of breathing. I used to think my father was a hero, a man who stayed when everyone else ran. But 3 days ago, I found a rusted key hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of the Bible in our attic, and suddenly, every memory I had of my childhood began to rot. Some secrets don't stay buried, especially when the person who buried them is still alive and watching you from across the dinner table. My father always told me my mother left us because she couldn't handle the isolation of the mountains. He told me she packed a single suitcase and walked out into the snow, never looking back. For 22 years, I lived with that rejection, a cold stone sitting in the center of my chest. I believed I wasn't enough to make her stay. But as I stared at that key, a key to a cellar I didn't know existed, I realized the story I'd been told wasn't just a lie. It was a prison. What I found beneath the floorboards of our old shed didn't just change my life, it shattered the very foundation of who I thought I was. You see, in a small town, people think they know everything about their neighbors. They see the surface, the polite nods at the grocery store, the shared prayers on Sunday. But the real truth? The real truth is what happens when the porch lights go out and the fog rolls in from the lake. And that's when everything changed. Silver Lake isn't the kind of place you visit. It's the kind of place you end up in when the rest of the world forgets you exist. Tucked deep into a valley where the sun sets 2 hours earlier than everywhere else, the air always smells of damp cedar and wood smoke. It's a town of whispers and long shadows. The lake itself is a dark, glassy eye that reflects the jagged peaks of the Blackwood Range, and they say it's so deep that the bodies of the old loggers from the 1920s are still perfectly preserved at the bottom, held in a permanent, icy embrace. The weather here is a character of its own. It doesn't just rain, the sky collapses. A thick, gray mist crawls up from the water every evening, swallowing the gravel roads and the weathered Victorian houses until you can't see your own hand in front of your face. You learn to navigate by sound, the rhythmic thud-thud of the old mill, the distant cry of a loon, and the unsettling creak of the pines swaying in the wind. There's a heaviness to the atmosphere, a feeling that the trees are leaning in to listen to your conversations. Every house is spaced just far enough apart that a scream would be swallowed by the forest before it reached a neighbor's ear. It's beautiful, in a haunting, tragic sort of way. But that beauty is a mask. Beneath the moss and the wildflowers, there's a grit that sticks to your skin. It's a place where time moves backward, and the past is never truly gone. But that wasn't the strangest part of living there. Block 3, Main Character Introduction. My name is Elias Thorne, and for most of my life I was the reliable one. I worked as a local surveyor, measuring the land, drawing boundaries, and making sure everything stayed in its rightful place. Maybe I chose that profession because my own life felt so boundless and chaotic after my mother vanished. I'm a man of maps and logic, of tangible facts and hard data. I live in a small cabin on the edge of my father's estate, a place I built with my own hands to find some semblance of independence. Growing up, it was just me and my father, Silas. Silas Thorne is a pillar of Silver Lake, the man people go to when they need a loan or a word of advice. He's stern, quiet, and carries himself with a gravity that demands respect. Our relationship was built on a foundation of unspoken rules. Don't ask about the past, don't mention the name Elena, and always keep the woodpile stacked. I loved him, but it was a love rooted in fear and gratitude. He was the one who didn't leave. He was the one who protected me. Lately, though, the weight of his protection has started to feel like a chokehold. I'm 28, yet I still feel like that 6-year-old boy waiting by the window for a woman who was never coming back. I've struggled with a sense of displacement my whole life, an emotional phantom limb where a mother should be. I don't have many friends. People in Silver Lake stay in their own lanes. My only real connection is Sarah, the local librarian, who looks at me with a pity I can't stand. I was content, or so I thought, living a life of quiet routine. But the real secret was still hidden, waiting for a rainy Tuesday to tear its way out. Block 4, the first disturbing event. It started with the birds. One morning, I walked out onto my porch to find a dozen starlings lying dead on the steps. No marks on them, no signs of struggle, just a pile of feathered husks, their eyes clouded over. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off as some strange environmental fluke. That was until I saw my father standing by the old tool shed at the back of the property, staring at the ground where another group of dead birds lay. He didn't look surprised. He looked expectant. When he noticed me, his expression shifted instantly back to his usual stoic mask. Cold snap, he muttered, though the air was unusually warm for October. He quickly shoveled the birds into a black plastic bag and walked toward the woods. Later that night, I heard a sound that didn't belong in our quiet valley. It was a low, rhythmic thumping coming from beneath the earth. It wasn't the mill, and it wasn't the wind. It sounded like a heartbeat, heavy and slow, vibrating through the floorboards of my cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside, the mist clinging to my clothes like wet cobwebs. I followed the sound toward the old shed, the one my father kept padlocked year-round. As I approached, the thumping stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. I reached out to touch the handle, but a hand gripped my shoulder from behind, nearly making me jump out of my skin. It was my father. His eyes were wide, and for the first time in my life, I saw a flicker of genuine panic in them. "Go back to bed, Elias," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The ground is shifting. It's dangerous." What happened next made everything worse. The next day, my father was gone before sunrise, leaving a note saying he had business in the next county. This was my chance. I went back to the shed, but the padlock had been changed. Frustrated, I returned to the main house, the house I grew up in. I started looking for the old key, searching through drawers and cabinets until I climbed into the attic. That's when I found the Bible. It was my mother's. Inside, the pages had been cut away to create a rectangular compartment. Nestled there was a heavy iron key and a small hand-drawn map of our property. The map had a single X marked, not on the shed, but beneath the floor of the root cellar in the main house. My heart was hammering against my ribs. Why would my mother hide a key in a Bible and draw a map to her own home? I descended into the root cellar, a cold, damp space smelling of dirt and old potatoes. I pulled back the heavy rug and began tapping on the stone floor. One of the slabs sounded hollow. Using a crowbar, I pried the stone up. Beneath it was a wooden hatch, and the iron key fit perfectly into the lock. As the hatch swung open, a rush of stale, metallic air hit me. I climbed down a narrow ladder into a hidden room. It wasn't a cellar. It was a sanctuary. There were shelves lined with journals, dozens of them, all in my mother's handwriting. But as I opened the first one, I realized these weren't diaries. They were logs, observations. My mother hadn't left me because she was bored. She was hiding. But from what? And that's when everything changed. I spent the afternoon huddled in that hidden room, reading my mother's words. She wrote about the eyes in the lake and a shadow that walks like a man. She described how the town of Silver Lake wasn't founded on timber, but on a pact made a century ago. She mentioned names of the town council, the mayor, and most disturbingly, my father. She claimed they were guarding the threshold. When I finally emerged, the sun was setting, casting long, bloody streaks across the sky. I walked into town, hoping to find Sarah at the library, but the atmosphere had shifted. People who usually ignored me were now watching me openly. Mr. Henderson, the grocer, stopped sweeping his porch as I passed, his eyes fixed on my mud-stained boots. The sheriff's cruiser followed me slowly for 3 blocks, never pulling me over, just hovering like a predator. I found Sarah closing up the library. When she saw me, she went pale. "Elias, you need to go home," she whispered, her hands shaking as she locked the door. "People are talking. They say you were seen in the cellar." "Who saw me, Sarah? The house is 3 miles from town." She wouldn't look at me. "The lake has ears, Elias. Your father, he's not who you think he is. He's the keeper. If you value your life, stop digging." "The keeper of what?" I demanded, but she pulled away, disappearing into the fog. I turned to walk home, but a dark SUV pulled up beside me. The window rolled down just an inch, and a voice I didn't recognize said, "Some things are better left in the dark, boy. Don't make us do to you what we did to her." But the real secret was still hidden. I didn't go home. I couldn't. I went to the lake. My mother's journals mentioned a place of reflection near the old pier. I hiked through the thick brush, the branches clawing at my face. Underneath the rotting timber of the pier, I found a small tin box buried in the silt. Inside was a collection of photographs. They were pictures of the lake taken at night, but they weren't of the water. They were of the lights under the water, strange, bioluminescent orbs that formed patterns. One photo caught my eye. It was a picture of my father, much younger, standing on a boat. He was holding a heavy chain that disappeared into the depths. Beside him was a woman I barely recognized, my mother. She looked terrified. On the back of the photo, she had scrawled, The price of the valley is a life every 20 years. Silas says it's my turn. He says he can't stop them. I felt sick. My mother didn't leave. She was a sacrifice. But 20 years had passed since she disappeared. If the cycle was real, that meant another sacrifice was due. I looked back at the town, the lights of Silver Lake twinkling innocently in the distance. How many people knew? How many mothers, daughters, and sons had been lost to the mountains over the decades? I realized then that the dead birds weren't a fluke. They were a warning. The lake was hungry again. And that's when everything changed. I raced back to our house, the map from the Bible clutched in my hand. There was a second X I had missed, one located deep in the woods behind the old tool shed. I didn't care about the padlock anymore. I grabbed an axe and smashed the door open. Inside, it wasn't tools I found. It was a shrine. The walls were covered in photos of me, from my first steps to my graduation all the way to last week. My father had been documenting my entire life, but not out of love. It looked like a study, like he was preparing me. In the center of the room was a stone altar, and on it sat my mother's wedding ring, polished and gleaming. I noticed a faint trail of blood leading from the altar to a trapdoor in the corner of the shed. I pulled it open and descended into a tunnel that smelled of ancient water and decay. The tunnel led downward for what felt like miles, the walls slick with a strange glowing moss. Eventually, the tunnel opened into a massive cavern that sat directly beneath the lake. The sound was deafening, the weight of millions of gallons of water pressing down on the stone ceiling. In the center of the cavern was a pool of black water, and floating in it was a figure. I ran to the edge, my heart stopping. It wasn't my mother. It was Sarah. She was tied to a weighted stone, her eyes wide with terror as the water slowly began to rise. "Elias!" she screamed. "He's here! He's behind you!" But that wasn't the strangest part. I spun around, axe raised, expecting to see my father. But it wasn't him. It was the entire town council. The mayor, the sheriff, Mr. Henderson, all of them wearing heavy, dark robes. And in the center of them stood my father, Silas. But he wasn't holding a weapon. He was bound and gagged, his face bruised and bloodied. "Elias," the mayor said, his voice echoing in the cavern. "You've arrived just in time. We were worried you'd be late for your coronation." "What is this?" I hissed, moving toward Sarah. "Your father is a failure," the mayor continued, stepping into the light. "He was the keeper, tasked with maintaining the pact. But he grew weak. He hid your mother. He didn't sacrifice her to the lake, he helped her escape. He's been lying to us for 20 years, telling us she was gone while he kept her hidden in that cellar, hoping we'd never find out." My head spun. My mother. She wasn't there. She wasn't dead. "But the lake knows," the mayor whispered. "It hasn't been fed and now the valley is dying. The birds are falling from the sky, the crops are rotting. We need a new keeper. Someone young, someone with the Thorn bloodline." They didn't want to kill me. They wanted me to be like them, to be the one who decided who lived and who died. They had kidnapped Sarah to force my hand. "Kill the girl, Elias," the mayor commanded, handing me a ceremonial blade. "Take your father's place and the Thorn family will be forgiven. Refuse, and you both go into the water." And that's when everything changed. I looked at my father. He was shaking his head, tears streaming down his face. He had spent 20 years living a lie, sacrificing his own reputation and my love for him, just to keep my mother alive in a hole in the ground. He had tried to protect me from this burden, but the town was a cult of tradition, a parasite living off the lake's dark energy. "No," I said, my voice steady. I dropped the blade. "I'm not a murderer, and I'm not a keeper." The mayor's face twisted into a mask of rage. "Then you are nothing." The townspeople moved forward, a wall of dark robes. I grabbed the axe I had brought and swung it, not at them, but at the stone pillars supporting the cavern ceiling. My mother's journals had mentioned that the cavern was unstable, that the only thing keeping the lake from swallowing the town was the guardianship of the stone. "If the lake wants a sacrifice," I yelled, "it can have the whole damn town." I struck the pillar again and again. Fissures began to spiderweb across the ceiling. Dust and pebbles rained down. The townspeople panicked, their robes fluttering as they scrambled toward the exit. I ran to Sarah, slicing her ropes with a pocket knife. I dragged her toward my father, cutting his bonds. "Elias, stop! You'll kill us all!" "We're already dead in this town, Dad," I screamed over the roar of the cracking stone. Run! We scrambled up the tunnel as the cavern behind us began to collapse. The sound was like 1,000 freight trains, a tectonic roar that shook the very earth. We burst out of the shed just as the ground beneath the lake began to sink. From the safety of the ridge, we watched as a massive whirlpool formed in the center of Silver Lake. The water didn't just rise, it was sucked into the earth. The pier, the old houses on the shore, and the town hall were dragged into the depths. The eyes in the lake my mother had written about, the bioluminescent creatures, swarmed to the surface, thousands of them, before being crushed by the falling stone. In the chaos, my father led us back to the house. He ran to the root cellar and pulled up the hatch. There, trembling in the corner of the hidden room, was a woman with gray hair and eyes that matched my own. My mother. She hadn't left me. She had been 3 feet below me for 20 years, living in silence, listening to my footsteps, watching me grow up through a small vent in the floor. The pact wasn't a supernatural necessity. It was a lie started by the town's founders to maintain control, a psychological grip used to keep the families of Silver Lake bound to the land. My father had been the only one brave enough to fake the sacrifice, but he was too cowardly to truly leave. He had traded her freedom for her life, and in doing so, he had turned our home into a tomb. The truth was finally out, but it was a truth draped in 2 decades of stolen time. The sun rose over a valley that no longer had a lake. Silver Lake was now a muddy, jagged crater, filled with the debris of a century of secrets. The townspeople who survived fled into the night, their power broken, their pact washed away by the very thing they worshipped. I stood on the porch of the house, watching my mother take her first steps in the open air. She touched a leaf, her fingers trembling, her eyes squinting against the brightness of the morning sun. My father stood a few feet away, a broken man waiting for a judgment I wasn't sure I could give. He had saved her, yes, but he had also stolen 20 years of her life and 20 years of mine. Sarah stood beside me, her hand in mine. We were the only ones left who knew the full story. The authorities would come, they would find the ruins, and they would call it a natural disaster, a sinkhole caused by old mining tunnels. But we knew. I looked at my mother, and for the first time, she smiled at me. It wasn't the smile of a ghost or a memory. It was real. We left that day. We didn't take much, just the journals and the Bible. As we drove away from the valley, I looked in the rearview mirror at the empty crater where the water used to be. The shadows were gone. The whispers had stopped. The town of Silver Lake was gone, buried under the weight of its own lies. And after years of silence, the truth finally found its way back to the surface. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, but the ones that survive, those are the ones that define who we become. I am Elias Thorne, and I am finally drawing my own map.